So just to be upfront about this piece, I discuss the Holocaust and I also touch on the conflict between Israel and Gaza. Nevertheless, I make a point of omitting visual imagery of the sorts of things you might think of in pertinence to these topics, such as starvation, murder, violence, and so on. Except in the last 15 seconds of this video, I did put in some scenes of people falling to their death in the movies Titanic and Les Miserables.
Forgive me, I could not resist.
So if you don't want to engage with that imagery, then the vast majority of this video is still accessible and you can just disengage with it a touch early. Some of my sources, however, employ this graphic imagery more heavily, and I will indicate which ones do in my reference list so that a viewer has the option to ensure that I'm not misrepresenting anyone's work while also knowing what they are getting into. So Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List is a 3-hour movie depicting the story of German industrialist Oskar Schindler purchasing the labor of some 1,200 Jews out of concentration camps to put to work at his factories, effectively saving them. And this movie is supposed to be really powerful and well made, with interesting symbols hidden in the text and good acting and everything that's supposed to move the audience and express the value of compassion and humanity and standing up for the day. And French filmmaker Claude Lanzmann freaking hated it. He wrote an angsty op-ed about the movie, which I learned about in college but can't find, so I'm just using Wikipedia. He called Spielberg's film a kitschy melodrama and said fiction is a transgression. And I didn't know what he was talking about when I first heard of this. Why is fiction transgressive? Well, he's referring to things like the Holocaust to say that there are some things that just shouldn't be portrayed in fiction because, like, is this what we do? We reenact the Holocaust? Do we add color to an otherwise black and white movie for the purpose of figuratively conveying some painfully sentimental idea, like about how the most timeless and precious aspects of our human nature emit from innocent and faithful manifestations? Do we add this non-diegetic music from outside of this universe for whatever emotional impact that this melody has on us? Other people hear the theme from Schindler's List, but I hear Steven Spielberg getting down on all fours and begging, "Oh, please, audience, tell me that my Holocaust movie made you feel emotions. Do you feel emotions yet? Please tell me that you feel emotions over my Holocaust movie." It's dumb that this movie is using music and literary devices because those things are supposed to convey emotion and diminish the proximity between the audience and the characters in the film. And, like, does Steven Spielberg think that his movie is going to do justice to the actual people of these concentration camps? It's excruciating watching this 3-hour long movie, but is a 3-hour movie going to do justice to the people who spent weeks and months and years of their lives in these places? Okay, so maybe a defender of the film could say that the movie wasn't trying to do justice to everything that was perpetrated on the people in the concentration camps, but instead the film wanted to portray an account through the eyes of Oskar Schindler. That is a somewhat less gauche use of these literary devices, and I would actually agree that that is what this film wanted to do, and it is less gauche, and it is also garbage. This is effectively Oskar Schindler's story. It's the title of the movie, it's Schindler's List. So what does that make the people upon whom all of these things were perpetrated in this film? They are the setting. The genocide serves as a backdrop against which Oskar Schindler is to shine like a star. This is also an uncomfortable use of the Holocaust, putting in these sorts of scenes to raise the stakes and supposedly make for a good story. This is a misuse of the Holocaust. And do you want to know what is another misuse of the Holocaust? I received some atrocity propaganda comparing the Holocaust to the attacks on Israel from October 7th, 2023.
June 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Nazi death squads, the Einsatzgruppen, enter Jewish communities wherever they can find them. They mercilessly slaughter entire families, men, women, children, infants, and the elderly. Their goal, the annihilation of the Jewish people. Genocide. October 7th, 2023, during a Jewish holy day, 1,500 members of Hamas death squads when you shout "Free Palestine," believing that you are supporting heroic freedom fighters. Stop and remember these atrocities. And never say, "We didn't know." For humankind to live, Hamas must be destroyed.
I received this at the end of April, almost 5 months into Israel's retaliation, the use of the Holocaust in this context being to outrage an audience into lending approval to Israel's conduct. I mean, there are things that the October 7th attacks had in common with the Holocaust, but amid Israel's retaliation, where concerns arise about how much destruction is being wreaked on Palestine's general population and not just Hamas. This piece in this context incorrectly frames people who don't approve of Israel's conduct as people who do approve of Hamas and Nazi Germany and anti-Semitism. That's not the argument that anyone in prominence is making, but that's the argument that lots of pro-Israel people in this "because we live in hell" culture war think that people are making when they don't approve of Israel's conduct.
Bernie Sanders has taken the side. He was parroting the talking points of Hamas and the Ayatollah in Iran. This is a time to choose a side. If Bernie Sanders wants to side with the terrorists, that's so be it. And if other Democrats want to do that, it's on them. But I'm telling you...
The October 7th attacks have some things in common with the Holocaust, but so does Israel's retaliation. There are Holocaust survivors who speak out against Israel's conduct and compare the conditions in Gaza to the conditions that they experienced in the 1940s.
I am a Holocaust survivor. All of my Jewish family was murdered, and it is not in their name that Israel is killing children. What the children in Gaza are going through is what I went through in terms of hunger and bombs falling on us. As a Jew, I find it horrific.
As not are against what's going on and what's going on in our name, and particularly what's going on in the name of Holocaust, which I think is a criminal thing, really, that they exploit the sufferings of the Holocaust to justify the present.
When Nazism was smashed in 1945, Jewish people cried out, "Never again." They meant never again for all humanity.
So inside of this, I find it inappropriate of this piece to bring up the Holocaust to sort of inflame audiences and mitigate guilt for behavior that many Holocaust survivors themselves condemned and remarked as being reminiscent of what they went through. It's not members of Hamas that Bernie Sanders is advocating for and sympathizing with when he speaks out against Israel's conduct, Mike Johnson. When the Holocaust is analogized to Gaza, the comparison serves this function of calling for the cessation of these humanitarian hostilities that are coming at the expense of a region's general population. Tons of these people had nothing to do with the October 7th attacks, and some people display just a very astonishing incapability to understand this, let alone understand why Israel's conduct is being criticized.
I will be world champion one day. When? In 3 years. You'll be 60 in 3 years. If you win, what'll you do next? I don't understand. If you're world champion at 16, what'll you do with the rest of your life? I don't understand.
Of course, this is not all people who actively endorse Israel's conduct. Some people stand with Israel and simultaneously want Palestinian civilians to be free of oppression, and they may even have a criticism or two of Israel's conduct. These are stances that I can relate to much more. I don't feel very interested in associating myself with one side of this culture war, but I would say that I am in support of Israel. I want Hamas to to not exist and for its members to be arrested, and I want the remaining Israeli hostages to be returned. I want Israel to be efficacious in defending itself and being a safe place for its people, be they Jews or non-Jews, and I think that this can be accomplished with a different course of action from what Netanyahu and other Israeli officials are engaging in. I think that it can be accomplished by having Israel display transparency as it pertains to human rights practices. So I guess some people have thought, wow, for a state whose government is led by lots of people who are pretty far to the right and who enforce pretty regressive politics and idolize mass murderers who open fire in mosques and resist a two-state solution with the transparent intent of annexing the rest of Palestine, the massive human toll on Gaza is a pretty convenient symptom of Israel's defense of itself.
Netanyahu says, oh, it was a mistake, all right? I mean, that's always the answer. I mean, either it's always that it's Hamas embedding in civilian infrastructure, or it was a mistake. But at a certain point, you have to consider the possibility that it is what it looks like.
So, as someone with Israel's best interest in mind, I think that it would be beneficial for Israel to eliminate the suspicion of people like Naomi Klein by being more open about their operations. Take, for example, this explanation in Israel's defense that Hamas is using hospitals and schools as bases, knowing that it could paint any Israeli action against them as yet more evidence of Israel's desire to harm Palestinian civilians. Well, that would put me at much more ease in this matter of my tax dollars and my Jewish name going toward Israel. Let's check out these reports and confirmations. Okay, so actually most of these sorts of claims are based on vague information that really has no displayed evidence beyond some Israeli or American spokesperson's verbal word. Asked what evidence or support or sourcing he had to support the claim that he made about Hamas, Kirby responded, "The information comes from a variety of intelligence sourcing. I think you can understand that we're not going to be able to provide a whole lot of granular detail on that. We have to protect sources and methods, but we were able to downgrade some information, but it comes from a variety of intelligence methods of our own. So this is not quite enough evidence to defeat Naomi Klein with facts and logic, and I have found this discouraging. I want to believe that Israel has indeed been taking all of the proper human rights practices into consideration, but it has turned out to be such a commitment thus far to get any transparency. Months after all of these protests and demonstrations, which for the most part have quieted down by now, there's been one single college that divested from holdings linked to Israel, and only a handful of others ceded any transparency at all. Okay, so in December of last year, Bernie Sanders proposed Senate Resolution 504, which essentially called for the U.S.'s financial support of Israel being contingent on the quality of human rights practices that the U.S. assesses from Israel's conduct. And I wrote a letter to my senators asking them to support this motion, and Dick Durbin did not respond. Tammy Duckworth did, saying that she will do no such thing because Sanders' motion was pursuant to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which does have absolutist language about ending security assistance for other countries that violate international human rights laws. But Sanders added a section saying that it doesn't have to be absolutist. We can still support Israel if we assess that the circumstances call for it, but whatever.
I just want some ketchup.
Searching the web. There are 3 pet shops near you.
No, I don't want a pet shop. I just want some ketchup.
Enjoy your meal.
Well, that was frustrating.
And then Tammy Duckworth's email went on to say that she doesn't unconditionally support Netanyahu, though, and she still has problems with some of his policies or whatever gets her response letters to be at letter length. I don't know. It kind of rang hollow for me. And Bernie Sanders' Senate resolution was overwhelmingly killed. I'm sorry. I honestly really like Tammy Duckworth, but yeah, if you happen to look through my sources, which again I encourage you to do, and you read the Senate resolution, feel free to let me know if I am insane for not understanding why it was so unpopular. Anyway, I also think that it would be nifty to know what exactly Israel is doing Benny Gantz resigned from the war cabinet on account of Netanyahu not having a plan for how the Gaza Strip would be governed after the war, and I was similarly wondering what Benjamin Netanyahu meant when he said that Israel's retaliation would not cease until Hamas was eliminated, because Hamas is a military and political movement, and I feel like these sorts of terms are liable to misuse and overgeneralization.
Bernie Sanders has taken the side. He was parroting the talking points of Hamas.
Okay, so these things would be helpful to Israel because it does not give people as much room to oppose Israel's conduct. Lots of people all over the world would be much happier to support Israel if they knew more about what Israel was doing and about their end goals while adhering to human rights and practices. I really liked what Kamala Harris said, that the US supports Israel's right to defend itself and also that it matters how everyone does so. I liked her saying that this was not a binary issue. But if you're a viewer who feels the same way that Dennis Prager does,
think about these two questions. If tomorrow Israel laid down its arms and announced, "We will fight no more," what would happen? And if the Arab countries around Israel laid down their arms and announced, "We will fight no more," what would happen? In the first case, there would be an immediate destruction of the state of Israel and mass murder of its Jewish population. In the second case, there would be peace the next day. As I said at the outset, it is a simple problem to describe. One side wants the other dead. And if it didn't, there would be peace.
If you're like Dennis Prager and you believe that 100% of the conflict in the Middle East is Palestine's fault, Islam, the religion's fault, I don't agree with Dennis here, but at least he acknowledges that there's a bit of a cycle of violence here. I think that most people get that Israel and Palestine have been perpetrating all kinds of things onto each other, and in this long history of violence, each affront that has been perpetrated has sort of been justified by another affront that happened in the past. I disagree with Dennis Prager's claim that there would be peace if that side said we will fight no more. I think that there would still be some compensation that some people in Israel would feel entitled to the detriment of those people, and I think that some of Israel's leaders would still think of Israel as a state for the Jewish people and the Jewish people only, and would still openly talk about annexing the rest of Palestine. I imagine that we know in other countries that those sorts of things like the travel restrictions were originally attributed to acts of aggression perpetrated by Palestinians, but I don't imagine that the children in Palestine, and perhaps Palestinians in their 20s and 30s, I don't imagine that they know why those sorts of things have been imposed on them for their entire lives, and I imagine that they were probably misled about it. They were probably told that all of these sorts of things are in place because Israel doesn't want them to live the same qualities of life, and that Israel wants to annex their cities, and that Israel only wants to be a place for the Jewish people without Muslims. I feel like lots of Palestinian people are prone to thinking that Hamas serves their best interests, and while I think that for a lot of the part that proneness is inculcated by Hamas through deceptive means, I also feel like there are some things that Israel can do to present themselves as neighbors who are not worthy of fighting because they don't come after their best interests of Muslims or Palestinian people. That is another way that I think that Israel can actually work toward eliminating Hamas. Because I feel like what Israel's government is doing right now is just not working, and it's only perpetuating the cycle of violence. So people who know me well might understand that I am behaving more like a centrist than I actually am. I moved toward the center in hopes of meeting some middle ground with open-minded people who currently disagree with me on these issues. I wanted to communicate that these pieces do not contain any mind-altering revelations. People don't need to see the most gruesome images of genocide and terrorist attacks to know that they were bad. And to think otherwise completely misunderstands and does not even pertain to the assessments that they are supposedly challenging, which I thought was an important part of logic and discussion. But if I'm wrong and I'm missing something from these perspectives, then just let me know and I'll be happy to be proven wrong. But before you do that, let's get another objection or two out of the way. Muslims are bad or something and violent, and they are incapable of existing with people of other religions, so it's a hopeless pursuit to something. Fear of Islam is not called Islamophobia, it's called common sense. Literally, the Wikipedia page for Islam and violence cites that Muslims hold the least violent views among any religious group in America. World data found that a country's incidence of violence and a country's proportion of Muslims in its population have an inverse relationship. The Global Peace Index, which gives each country a peacefulness score based on 23 indicators, does not even correlate with each country's proportion of Muslims in its population, or what we know of as the Arab world. So it's unfair to attribute 100% of Hamas's violence to their religion. It's unfair to treat a random Muslim person like an Islamic terrorist. Comment deleted. There are passages in the Quran that call Muslims to take arms against non-believers. That is really horrible. It's a good thing that there's nothing in any Jewish or Christian religious text that anyone interprets as justification for mistreating people or that have been leveraged to create super weird and invasive policies. Okay, enough of this. I was kind of being pretentious and uncharitable towards Schindler's List earlier because it's fun to behave like you know film better than Steven Spielberg, but I'm not a very fun person to watch movies with. Schindler's List is fine. It has pros and cons, and some of the pros lend themselves to the fact that Oskar Schindler was a real person who saved over 1,000 Jews, and probably almost nobody would know about his story if this movie wasn't made. We usually don't get to know about these sorts of specifics when the Holocaust is covered in general education, and I think that it's also advantageous that Steven Spielberg used his power and influence as a big filmmaker to augment the Holocaust's presence in our culture. I think that we can never talk about the Holocaust too much, and continually applying it and remembering it is the best way that we can preclude those millions of people from having died in vain. Again, though, it's debatable to what extent Schindler's List actually does this, seeing that the story was fictionalized and melodramatic and kind of exploitative of violence. But how about we take a look at the man himself who lobbed this criticism. Claude Lanzmann created a film in 1985 called Shoah, which to this day is the longest movie to have received a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and the 6th longest movie period. It took him 11 years to edit more than 300 hours of interview footage with perpetrators, survivors, and witnesses. So like Schindler's List, Shoah is an excruciating watch, but it's excruciating for all the opposite reasons that Schindler's List is excruciating. Shoah makes a point of not including any reenactment, while Schindler's List is a reenactment. Schindler's List is overstimulating, while Shoah is understimulating. It has lots of these uncomfortably quiet scenes that create this figurative low air pressure where you feel like your eyes are going to get sucked out of your head. It's so quiet. It reminds me of this Jewish tradition in mourning called Shiva, which has rules for doing or not doing some things for a certain period of time. This includes not shaving for some time. Some people cover their mirrors for a few days. You're supposed to sit low to the ground. You're not supposed to have intercourse or listen to music. Basically, the point is to not enjoy yourself because it's a bit gauche to do so when a loved one has recently died and no longer has those capacities to maintain themselves or indulge in the fruits of life. I understand Shoah as a sort of eulogy for the people of the Holocaust, and in this way, Claude Lanzmann is able to give an everlasting name to these stories. It's a very astounding accomplishment, I think, because these, of course, were people who the Nazis wanted to erase, burning away documentation and killing a greater number of people than we can fathom. And so another film that I think gives an everlasting name to the people of the Holocaust is Andre Singer's Night Will Fall. This documentary was about how the Allied forces were instructed to film everything as they liberated the concentration camps more quickly than the German soldiers were able to obfuscate what they had done. And The documentary shows a fair amount of the footage that the Allied forces got, and a lot of what is said about this documentary and the footage is advice to view this content with discretion, for the images in it cannot be unseen. Night Will Fall also got a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I think that Night Will Fall also very much lends itself to making it so that people of the Holocaust did not lose everything that they did in vain. But I think it's a shame that pieces that refrained as they did from melodrama and that refrained from this almost capitalizing on genocide to make for a good story, it's a shame that they are not going to be as well known and culturally significant as Schindler's List. A lot of people watch Schindler's List just for the sake of watching a Spielberg film, and it's a shame that such is not the case for these other pieces that are better about how they handled the topic. So I hope that the Holocaust remains super prevalent forever and that its presence in general education only grows. I hope that the sorts of concepts that I talked about can be generalized. Perhaps a viewer, if they were not able to before, can now understand why Roberto Benigni's film Life is Beautiful kind of sucks and is super insensitive with its whole embracing life in death camps thing. Sophie's Choice also did not have to use the Holocaust as its context, but it did. These death scenes in Titanic and Les Mis are gauche, and it's also too much to ask from the audiences to take them seriously.